Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to our third and the final accessibility heuristics session. I'm Aparna Pasi, accessibility team lead with DQ. Overall, have an experience of 12 plus years with usability and accessibility. Denis, on to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Denis here, principal consultant, training lead at DQ Systems. Something like 18 years in accessibility or so. And yeah, let's get started with today's content by first looking into going back to something that I quickly mentioned on the previous session, but that we did get questions for since then about using the tracking system that we've been showing over the past two sessions, and also the distinction between the measure and the rating, because they do seem to be very similar. So I thought we'd put a slide together to sort of explain that a little bit more before we dive into today's content, just to give more context. So of course, we're talking accessibility heuristics. Therefore, if you're familiar with heuristics evaluations, you're aware that in most cases, what you work with is the rating part, where you basically say whether or not the interaction you've designed, the component, the asset that you've designed, it either meets or doesn't meet the essence of the heuristic itself. And that would be your check or X columns. Oftentimes, we also find another column, sometimes portrayed with a star, like you can see on the screen, or other things. And that one is when you actually go beyond the idea of simply meeting the spirit of that heuristic. So that's the heuristic part. So what we do basically is we are going to go through all these different statements for a particular heuristic, and for each of those things, see whether or not we meet it, or when we go above and beyond meeting it. And that's the first intent of the format, or the, the the grid itself. And the measure part, of course, because this is accessibility, and we work or deal a lot with requests for compliance, then we also measure the compliance itself to WCAG. Whoops. So yes could be considered like pass, no could be considered like fail, or failing a success criterion, and not applicable is usually either a matter of something just doesn't apply, or it's undetermined in the context of a mock-up or a wireframe, because a lot of the different things that we look for in accessibility are based on source code. So when you're only looking at design JPEGs or PNGs or whatnot, then some of those things you just can't measure. So that's basically how we use these things. So as we go through the heuristics today, the last three heuristics that we have, we can get back to that a little bit. But hopefully that helps set the context for how to use those grids. So this is a reminder of the heuristics that we've been working with so far. So we've shown you 7 in the last two sessions. We are going with the last 3 today, which are number 8, 9, and 10. So multiple interaction methods, timing and preservation, and then movement and flashing are the ones we're going to be covering. And I'm going to pass it over to Aparna to talk about the first one, multiple interaction methods.
Thank you, Denis. So the 8th heuristic that we look into when we evaluate a wireframe or a prototype is the multiple interaction methods. So what it basically asks you is that users can efficiently interact with the system without having dependency on the device. Say whether it is a mouse or a keyboard or a head stick or a mouth stick, whatever it is, they should be able to still efficiently interact with the system. Now, moving on, let us see the points that we need to cover as part of this heuristic. So the first statement would be, have we designed anything to be mouse specific? Like if you see the flyout menus where you kind of hover on a menu item and you get a drop down or a sub menu for that menu item. So are we designing it only for mouse users, or do we have an interaction for the keyboard users as well? So any interaction that is present on the web page should be both for mouse and keyboard user, or any, as a matter of fact, any device that the user might be using to interact with it. The next statement is, how is every functionality designed to be fully keyboard accessible, which is a way of putting the above heuristic in a different word, whether we are ensuring the entire functionality of the page to be fully keyboard accessible. So again, we are here talking about device independent event handlers to be used, as well as the interactions to be both mouse and keyboard accessible. Now, the following that statement is, are features designed to be fully functional using touch screens? Because when we kind of design certain interactions, we keep the mouse keyboard users, but then when the page goes into a responsive mode, you are basically talking about touch interaction or touch screens. So are we designing that to be fully functional using touch screens is another point. So we will certainly see in some time the distance between the buttons or links, as well as the touch target area. All these things come into play. So you need to keep these in mind when you're designing the functionality or the interactions. And then the fourth statement that we really look at is, are the design instructions realistic from a tabbing, touch, or voice perspective? Right? How realistically are we designing when we have to tab through? Are we giving too many additional tabs? Are those many tabs required? Are we having the perspective to let the user speak to the system and let the assistive technology that user is using have the take the advantage of the voice perspective? So all these interactions again need to be kept in mind when we are really designing the interactions. And then following the same line, can the design interactions be operated through voice commands? So when we say that statement, where you say the button, if I have a disability, motor disability, and I want to use my voice command to activate a button, am I having that kind of design interaction already in mind? So having multiple input methods using different devices is what you need to keep in mind when we have the talk about multiple interaction methods. And then last but one is are we limiting the number of tab stops? So because it is important for a keyboard user or a screen reader user to get through the entire functionality in minimum tab stops. So are we doing that, or are we, we will definitely showcase an example for this statement where I would really explain you what we mean by combining adjacent links. And then the last statement is about the target areas between the call to action is at least 44 by 44 pixels, because otherwise, if I wanted, there were many times when I actually zoomed the mobile screen to be able to activate the button that I really want to, because it happens to be that I want to say confirm, but then I end up activating the cancel button because the space between them, the target area is so less that my finger happens to activate a wrong action. So now we shall see some examples of these statements. The first one would be the keyboard operability. So if you see when we were redesigning our website, we had these the mega menu. We still have it on our website, and this is how it was on the first image. The top image with the gray color theme was showcasing that particular mega menu. And when we did the review, we made sure that the image onto the bottom left is the one that is using a mouse, and then the following one is using the keyboard. So we kind of made sure that we had both the interactions designed for both mouse and keyboard. That way, we are ensuring that this mega menu, which is not seen when it is in its default state, is still accessible via mouse as well as the keyboard. And the statement that you really need to focus is every functionality designed to be fully keyboard accessible or not. In case that is not the case, then you need to have that interaction implemented right when you're designing itself. Then the next example that we have is about the number of tap stops. So if you see the wireframe again, you would see that we have three sections, like do I need a service, that basically could get a tap focus. And then the next tap would be to the button, which is like which accessibility solution is right. So now for me to be able to reach that, or to reach that page about the accessibility solutions, I will have to tap through to the two, do I need a service, and then to the button. So which is like not really needed, because my main focus is that I should be taken to this particular page. So we reduce those number of tap stops by directly moving the focus to the button and not to the container. So what did we achieve? We achieved by reducing the number of tap stops for a screen reader user as well as a keyboard user. The effort has come down, and so will the user experience. It will give you a much better user experience. So whenever possible, always try to limit the text and the adjacent links together, so the tap stops become less. And the final example that we have from this heuristic is this particular one, which says always make sure that you design your call to action sets to have at least 44 pixel space in between, 44 by 44 pixels, because otherwise, as I was telling before, there's every chance that you tend to activate the wrong action while the page is not zoomed. So only when you zoom, you will be able to do that, because the target area is pretty close in between those call to action sets. So this completes the multiple interaction methods heuristic, and I will pass on to Denis to take it further.
Thank you, Aparna. So the next one is about timing and preservation. The idea of the heuristic here is that the content on the page can easily be read and understood by users of this. Actually, that's not the right one. Sorry, my mistake. Copy and paste error here. The idea here basically is that we are, funny how you look at that for 2 weeks and then you still forget something. So the idea here is to be able to control timeout sessions, the time limitations in time that you may have, and also being able to preserve information if you get logged out, or if you have to come back and to sort of finish the text that you're working on at a later time or sometime in the future. We'll have that fixed before we send you the deck. And the statements that work with this heuristic are the following. So they're broken down into 3 different ideas. The first one is about time extensions and time limits being extended in general. So we're thinking about users having being provided with a mechanism that allows them to ask for a time extension ahead of time. So it's one thing to have a session timeout that will eventually run out and tell you that you're about to be logged off. But if you know that you're going to need more than, say, 15 minutes to do that one thing you want to do, it would be a better experience if you could ask for that ahead of time, so you don't have to stress out about that timeout eventually popping up while you're in the middle of doing something. So adding the information or asking for that feature ahead of time is one of the ways in which we can make the experience more pleasant for users in general. Still related to timeouts, are they when a timeout is actually being triggered? Is this something that's clearly identified as such in the design? Is the information provided so that, again, users don't become surprised or it doesn't come unexpectedly to them? And then when those messages do come up, when there's a time limit or the session runs out, being able to either turn off, extend, adjust that time limit is also part of what we're thinking about, to allow someone who would require more time to request it and ultimately be able to submit or complete the task as another user would that doesn't require as much time. That's the first idea. Second idea is about interruptions that may happen during your experience. It could be that you're on this particular site and then a new say you're on an air carrier site, you're booking a flight, and then for some reason uh, the prices change while you're in the middle of something. You will sometimes see these messages that come up that tell you that something has changed, the context may have changed, or price points may have changed, or something may have changed that is important enough in the context of that website, so that the website owners feel like it's important to stop you in your track and then give you a piece of information. So the idea here is that depending on context, depending on what the sites are and all that stuff, of course, having the ability to sort of opt out of those interruptions if you're in the middle of a particular task, or just being able to request those updates on your own terms, basically. So the first one is about does the design offer options to postpone or suppress those interruptions entirely, and then can you request content updates instead of content being updated automatically as you're going through content. And then the third idea is about reauthentication. So if you're filling out a form, you're through a task of filling out information, providing data, and you somehow either get logged off, you have to stop in the middle of what you're doing because you have to take care of something else, whatever the reason may be. Can you stop what you're doing at this point, be able to save that information, and when you come back, take it again from where you were, as opposed to having to start all over again from scratch? And the two statements that are related to that are: is there a mechanism to allow data recovery after users reauthenticate? So keep working on what you're doing, and as you're filling out your form, can you save that data as needed so that it can still be used after you authenticate? So the first example is about interruptions, and arguably, so this relates to success criterion 2.2.4, and we did a lot of research to try and find good examples of that online, implementation examples. We really couldn't find any. Even asked the W3C to see the archives of WCAG 2.0 when it was initially created, because every single success criterion needs to have two examples of implementation in the wild before it's approved as a success criterion, and we couldn't even find traces of those implementations initially. So I had to make a couple of things up here, but hopefully it will help you figure out how or what the idea is. So I took a screenshot of MarketWatch and grayscaled it to pretend like it would be like a very high fidelity wireframe, but it's actually today's version of the site. And it doesn't have any options, of course, for automatic updates, but it's a great example of a situation where content gets updated on the fly. And if we were to make this accessible by providing a live region or an alert on every single thing that changes, it would be completely unmanageable for someone with a screen reader, because there's just too much changing at once. So someone who has a screen reader or uses a screen reader needs, or would need ideally, to be able to turn off all those things and only ask for updates on the ones that are relevant to them, where they are, and based on what they're currently doing, because their process is much more linear than a sighted person's process would be. And examples of ways to do that would be to maybe have a checkbox in your interface that says, check this checkbox if you want to turn off automatic updates, because by default we expect that they would be turned on, but you could at least turn them off. And then if you can uncheck it, if you want to turn them back on again, that could be an option. Or you could have settings, just like we have on our phones or on our mobile devices, where you could toggle between on and off on things like automatic updates or content interruptions in general. And again, opt out of those things if you want to. And doing that provides someone who needs these particular considerations to get them, while the rest of the people who don't really care or are totally fine with actually adding the interruptions or the updates can still benefit from those things. The second one that we had was about session timeouts. So time extensions in general, being notified about these things, being able to extend the limitations and things like that. So what we have on the left-hand side of the screen is just a regular session timeout that tells you that you're going to be logged out due to an activity. And you can either click the log off button or stay logged in if you click the other button. But again, it's more accessible, it's more interesting from an accessibility standpoint if, as your little modal pops up, that you have a timer set to it. So what we see on the top right corner, the second image, the message says for the window, the modal window, the message says your session will expire automatically in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. That timer is counting down until it gets to 0. At 0, it does kill the session entirely because it's assuming that no one is there. But it gives you the ability to continue that session if you want to. So it provides that extra piece of information that allows you to understand what's going on and maybe make a better choice, or at least give you the options that would allow you to finish what you're trying to do. And ultimately, if the session does time out, then you get that message. All of these things, of course, being conveyed to your assistive technologies, though that's the developer's responsibility to make those things happen. We feel that it's a designer's responsibility to at least capture those requirements, those requirements in general in the documentation that goes along with the wireframe, so that the developers know what to do with those things. And then finally, re-authentication. So same thing, try to find examples of websites where it would automatically save your data, give you the ability to opt in on saving data, or that would just retrieve that data if you end up leaving and coming back. Couldn't really find anything that worked. So found a wireframe of a rather complex process with a form, which is a 6-step process in this case, with a pretty long form, with modal windows. So there's a bunch of things happening. You have multiple steps through that process. So it's very likely that you may not be able to do the entire process in one sitting. So having the ability here again to save what you're doing, so that you can stop at some point and continue later on, would definitely make the experience much more usable for everyone. But also from an accessibility standpoint, it also covers the fact that some people might get tired more quickly than others. And while they could do the entire thing in one sitting, they might need to take a break. So having the ability, again, to opt in to saving your data and making sure that you're not going to lose all of that information is what we have in mind when we think about that particular heuristic. So examples of that, again, could be just like I showed you for the interruptions before, but having a checkbox that allows you to either save your data and resume where you left off the next time you log in, or again, just a toggle switch that allows you to automatically save and preserve your data would be examples of how to do that. Or just a regular button that allows you to click on it to save at that point. In some cases, what we see is that, and you can see like in the wireframe, though it's kind of pale, but there's a previous and next step button at the top bottom left, the bottom right corner. So sometimes people will simply save the data automatically when you click on next step, but that doesn't always happen. And that would obviously be a minimum if you wanted to sort of address this particular concern with the heuristic. So those are examples of what we had for timing and preservation. I'm going to turn over to Aparna to talk about movement and flashing.
Thank you, Denis. So this brings us to the last heuristic that we have for you, which is the movement and flashing. And what is that we really have to look out is the elements on the page that move, flash, or animate in other ways can be stopped and do not distract or harm the users. So this heuristic mainly talks about auto-updating content or content that would flash or have animations. So if we go into the heuristic statements for this particular heuristic, it would be, the first one would be, can moving or animated content be paused, stopped, or hidden? Right? So when you have, you might be wondering, who would it really affect? It would affect anyone who is having a cognitive disability, or who is prone to have headaches, or epileptic seizures, it would be really, or not just them, even for a screen reader user, or in fact, even for even if you by yourself want to read the content, if it is moving every 2 seconds or 3 seconds, it would be really difficult to kind of get through that content. And the animations might distract us. So they should always have a functionality or an option to pause, stop, or hide. If you do not have a functionality to pause and stop it, there should be a way to hide it. So one way or the other, for a user to enable the moving or animated content to be paused should be provided. And then the next one would be about the auto-updated content. This is essentially like a carousel or that kind of element, which is auto-updating itself after a certain time. So is it really giving the full control to the user? No, because whether I have finished reading the content or not, after that particular time limit, that particular element would get auto-updated. Now, we all might have different times for us to be able to understand the content or to get the intent behind that particular content there. So it is essential to let the user be in control and have that control to go through the content at their own pace. The third statement is about whether there is a visible control for adjusting volume. So sometimes when you go onto these sites, we just hear a loud voice or noise or music playing, and you kind of keep searching where exactly is it. So in those cases, it is we tend to just press the mute button on our devices, but that is not the way it should be. That particular the audio control should have a volume adjustable control visible to everyone, and the user should be able to mute it or reduce, just minimalistic the volume that is coming out. So do we, if at all we have that kind of audio, do we provide that functionality to the user is the third statement. That basically that's what it's talking about. Then the fourth one is about the audio and video files which are set to autoplay. So when the page loads, you tend to have some videos or audios that would set to autoplay. If we have them, we need to again have a functionality to pause, stop, pick, or hide them, because again, it would be not just the success criterion violation, but also the usability part of that particular page is widely compromised. So if you have video or audio files that would autoplay, always have a option to pause or stop them. Now, the most important one, I think, is are there any flashing or blinking effects faster than 3 times per second? Because this can actually cause harm to a human life. This causes epileptic seizures, which is like really sometimes becomes life-threatening. So do not have flashing or blinking effects that would last for 3 times per second. Now, the next following that is are users required to react quickly to information or user interface features? Like the way we discussed about the auto-updating content. Let's say you're giving some kind of a feature that would disappear about in 10 seconds or 20 seconds. Are we given enough time for the user to interact with it? Maybe I read the content slowly, so I need more time to be able to understand it. And do not have anything that is like set with the time. Asking the users to react quickly, say yes or no, or confirm, otherwise this option is going to be disappearing. Do not have that kind of design interactions. And then the last one can the rate at which content is auto-updated be controlled by the user? Can I tell the system that if you're auto-updating, I need it to be after 1 minute or 2 minutes, or the time that I prefer to be auto-updated? Is that feature available? If at all, I have an auto-update feature. But ideally, you should always have a pause stop. Now, looking at the examples of this, the first one is the auto-updated content. Now, if you see the left side image, there's a slider that's present. You see the previous next icons, buttons, and then you also have these 5 image buttons that would say that there are 5 images in the carousel. But can I, or as a user, am I able to interact with it, to move through it? No, because I don't see a pause button. And if it's an auto updated content, then it is automatically updating after a certain time. So I cannot pause or stop it. Now, if you see to the right, the particular slider has a pause button being displayed. So which is giving the user the ability to control the auto updating content. So whenever I want to go to the next slide, I pause it, I read through the content, I understand the intent behind it, and then I either press the next button or play it. So that way, as a user, I'm in control of the auto updating content speed. The next slide is about having the audio control. Now, again, if you see the left side image, there is this video that's being, or the audio that's being played. We see that there is a slider which is showing the progress of the video, but nowhere do I see an audio control that is visible, right? So if I really want to reduce the volume, or if I want to mute it, there is no way that that can happen. If you look at the right side image again, you see that particular audio control visible. The button is there, it's playing. I can control the audio level, or I can mute it. Either way, I have the control visible at any point of time. And that is very important. And then the final example from this heuristic is the flashing content. I think the best examples would be the Incredible 2 movie, as well as the Japanese movie. I'm sorry, it just flashed that Pokemon. Yes, I remember now. The Pokemon movie, which comes out with that big flash behind it, and the Incredible 2 also has like a lot of flashing content, which actually forced the Disney movies to put up a warning for any user or for any viewer who would have epilepsy that it might trigger. So it is like pretty dangerous for a human life. And as you know, we at DQ, when we see it, we definitely raise a flag, and it is like a critical issue. That's a blocker. You cannot move forward with it. So never have flashing content, and that would last for 3 times per second. Avoid it, but it is something that you really don't want to have it on your website. So the best examples, never have those things. And the statements that you really need to look at them is, are there any flashing or blinking effects that last more than 3 times per second? And are users required to react quickly to information, like if there's a flashing content, so I need to move away from it? Is that kind of thing present there? The best advice that we can give is not to have such kind of content displayed on your web page. So that completes all the 10 heuristics, and I pass it on to Denis to conclude the.
Thank you. So we thought we'd wrap this up by sharing a couple of resources with you, references with you, so that you can start using these materials and maybe adapt them to your needs, look into different ways you could be using them or using parts of them to either help yourself as you're working with accessibility as a designer, or maybe share with your colleagues that do design so that they can wrap their head around these considerations as part of their role in the life cycle. So what we'll be sharing with everyone is the spreadsheet that has the entire list of the checkpoints first. They're essentially the same statements that you've seen across all 10 heuristics over the past 3 sessions, but there's this Excel spreadsheet that we will be sharing with you. And I wanted to show you what that might look like in terms of a report as well. As we're working with these tools and as we're defining the best approach, this is our best approach today to presenting it in a way that's digestible, is where we'll have say screen captures of a mock-up or a page or a wireframe, and then broken down by heuristic, we're going to have that list again, and then we define if something is either passing, not passing, not applicable. So in this case, it was mostly an exercise in assessing a design for WCAG compliance. But you can imagine how you could have a set of columns again for the rating and just do this as a heuristics evaluation exercise where a couple of designers, for instance, might be looking at the same interface and then take notes, each one on their own, as to how they feel, and then come back into a larger group and discuss if there are things that need to be improved based on everyone's findings. So, and breaking it down this way makes it more manageable, I think, than having a super long spreadsheet like this, for instance. So we like that format for that kind of work. So I thought I'd share the idea with you as well. And then what we're finalizing today, and of course making accessible before we release it, is the next version of that heuristics document that we've been talking about the whole time. That has all 10 heuristics, and then has one page for each of those heuristics that are that basically give you a more designed approach to the data itself. So not a spreadsheet, but something more visually appealing that would share all that information. So this is coming up soon as a follow-up to this session. I guess sometime next week or something like that, but soon enough. And then something I also wanted to share, because the timing was just so perfect. You may be familiar with the 24a11y.com website that produces 24 posts about accessibility between the 1st of December and the 24th of December. So I was lucky enough to be one of the contributors this week, and the article on the heuristics was scheduled on December 6th of all days, so today. Without me even asking for it, so that's great. But the article was released this morning, and basically it gives context again about the need for those heuristics and how basically the accessibility community as a whole has generally been sort of downsizing the effort related to accessibility, and how we need to sort of recognize that there's complexity there, much more than we like to admit, and that hopefully using a system like those heuristic can make it easier for designers to wrap their head around the content, the concepts, and start applying them in their work as well. So if you don't know about 24a11y.com, I recommend it. The articles are great. Last year was the first year, so you already have something like 30 articles to go through from last year, and the 6 for this year so far. And there's going to be another one every single day until we hit Christmas. So lots of good stuff for you to read if you want to. And with that said, I'm going to turn over to actually, no, before we do that, we're going to get the questions. But I wanted to invite you in 2019 to keep this going on this journey with us about UX webinars in general. We have a couple of ideas we'd like to explore, like the importance of involving users with disabilities in testing, talking about inclusive design principles in general. We're debating whether or not we would like to have a panel where we could discuss the differences between accessibility, universal design, inclusive design, and all these different things. Just try and wrap our heads around what they actually mean, because for a lot of people, they're synonymous, and really, I personally feel that they're really different. But so that might be part of what we discuss also, and pretty much anything else related to UX that people would be interested in, you folks would be interested in. So keep an eye on our webinars page on the site. So that's in our main menu, news resources. There's a webinar sub element there that leads you to that page. And if you have any special requests, we have about another 18 minutes or so. So if you have ideas about things you'd like for us to cover, then we're eager to hear about those too. So now, with that said, we're going to turn it over to Laura to handle all the questions and all that stuff. Thank you.
Great job. Thanks, Denis. Thanks, Aparna. And if folks, if after the webinar is over, they think of topics they want to hear more about in relation to UX, feel free to tweet at us or email me. I'll put my email in the chat box so people can reach out. But we have a question here, Aparna and Denis, asking about accessible maps. So say there's a map on a brochure with lots of points to show, with different varying locations. Is there a way to make something like that accessible?
You want to go first, Aparna, or do I go first?
You can go first, and then I will join and add in if I really have to.
Okay. Well, making maps accessible is probably one of the toughest things to do if you want to be very thorough about it, because there's so much information going on that it's very unrealistic to want to do that. What we tend to do or recommend is that when we're usually showing a map, and when we're really showing like an isolated piece of a map, like a very specific area of a map, what we want or what we recommend people to focus on are the actual data points or the locations that are relevant in that map, and describe that as the alternative to the map itself. Because there's no way that you could explain all the data that sort of comes in a map in general, especially if we're talking about a topographic map, for instance, where we're talking about like different levels of like different heights or different levels of say, I actually don't know how to say that in English, but topographic maps, basically.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about a map where we're defining, say, 5 different buildings in a city, the really relevant information about that map is really those 5 locations with all the addresses and all the related details provided in text adjacent to that map. So when we talk about accessibility of the content of the map itself, that's what we will usually focus on. If we're talking, or if what you mean is the accessibility of, like, the operability of that map from the perspective of whether or not you can use it with, say, a keyboard, that's a different story. If we're talking Google Maps, for instance, there are known and documented issues about the failings of using this properly with a map, with a keyboard. So the only way that I can think to overcome that is really to use JavaScript to overlay a new set of behaviors on that map, which is obviously complicated and time consuming and brittle, because as soon as something changes, then your whole set of JavaScript might break as well. And if we're talking, let's see, I thought I had another idea, but I think I forgot it. Yeah, so that's kind of what I would say in terms of the maps themselves. Oh yeah, the other part was sometimes also people, what they're going to do in order to sort of make things easier for users who use screen readers, they're going to purposefully set an aria-hidden equals true to that map, so it's no longer visible, and then they're going to focus on the alternative in text instead to sort of compensate for the visual asset that the map represents. Yeah, that was my other idea. So that's what I would say for this.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do, because if we have to really make the map itself accessible, then all the points needs to be keyboard operable. They need to have an appropriate role name and several other things. So if we can present the same information that's present on the map adjacent to it via text, and I think that's the best solution for making maps accessible.
Yeah, and maybe if I may add one thing, like going back to the idea of the heuristics themselves, as a designer, if you're choosing that there's going to be a map there and the map is going to show some information, following those heuristics would help you not forget about some of those things also. So whether it's thinking about those locations in text, or thinking about how you're going to think about the interaction itself if you're using a keyboard, making sure that some of those things are going, like to consider that the different features are going to be operable still. So depending on all those things, hopefully the heuristics help you keep that in mind as you're designing that particular asset.
Great, thanks guys. I have a quick question here. So this can be in relation to the 3 heuristics we covered today, or any other heuristics we covered in our past 2 sessions. But in the wild, when you're working with clients or on other wireframes and things like that, what are the heuristics or issues that you see designers struggle with the most, and what advice would you give to them regarding those?
So the one that I definitely see the most, and it's not going to be a surprise to most of you, is use of color and contrast.
Mhm.
It's by far the one thing that people usually talk about first when it comes to accessibility for designers. The whole idea of the like an accessible color palette. So by far, this is the most common one. Um, but
I think
then
the
there's
following that would be the focus indicator, Denny. That's
yeah,
another
good point.
thing that,
Yeah, very good point.
and visible labels is another one that we usually see, and let the clients know that you need to have a visible label for all form fields, or similarly grouping of the form fields and having a label for that. Um,
Yeah, another one that comes to mind that is not really related to a particular success criterion in WCAG 2.0 is visual proximity. Like if we actually let me just go back a couple of slides and show you something because I chose that one on purpose also, but didn't really mention it. So see on this slide here, we have the previous and next step button at the top, the bottom right corner, struggling again, bottom right corner of the interface. And in context, we see it, we get the information. But if you're zoomed in, if you're someone who uses as a low vision user using screen magnification, you are very unlikely to find those two buttons because they're so far from everything else. There's so much white space around it that you are likely to not even think that there might be something down there. So that we see a lot too. We can't really relate that to a particular success criterion in WCAG 2, like I said, but the idea that as you're running or conducting usability testing with people with disabilities, that stuff will come up. So it's something that while it's usually out of people's scope because it's not a double A thing or whatever. People are going to tend to want to address it also because once they see it, they can't unsee it anymore. So this visual proximity idea is something that we see quite a bit as well. That causes issues or that is reported often in these exercises.
Great, thanks, guys. We have another question here. So say people are trying to build in these heuristics or other accessibility methods into their UX process. How should they plan that time-wise? How do you estimate the time it'll take to measure and review these wireframes and then time to also fix the issues? How would you, what advice would you give to people who maybe are new to building that into their process?
Um, well, in terms of the evaluation process itself, it entirely depends on the complexity of the wireframes and the amount of wireframes. Um, I don't know if you'll agree with me, Aparna, but I would not expect, but I would estimate about an hour and a half on average on a mediumly complex wireframe to go through the entire list and take
yeah,
notes about those
yeah,
things.
that would be it, Denny.
Yeah, if you combine multiple people running those at the same time, then of course it adds up time. Usually, like a heuristics evaluation, we usually have at least 3 or 4 different designers doing
Mhm.
this concurrently, so that they can get back together and then sort of bump butt heads or compare at least their data, their findings. So there's time for that, and then remediating and fixing or adjusting your design is certainly a couple of hours on top of it. So it's kind of hard to establish or define what that might look like. But I would say probably if you have a set of maybe 10 heuristics, you probably are looking at something like 15 hours to do that, and then depending on how many things need to be fixed, there's probably another 5 to 10 hours of adjusting. So the process itself could, and with backs and forth with different people, I'm assuming easily 25, 30 hours to run through something like that would be reasonable in terms of providing the allocated time or the required time for someone to go through this.
And I guess just a clarification that came in regarding that question is, so that was, for wireframes and, before the site is built, but what if a site has already been built and they're just trying to do remediation with devs after the fact? How much more time do you think it is to fix a site once it's already in production versus before?
Oh, well,
Dev issues.
go ahead, Aparna.
I think it depends on the issue itself, but we definitely, on an average, I think it might take about 2 hours. If it is a simple or a moderate issue, it might take an hour, but it really depends on the issue. I think it's on average, you can say about 2 hours per issue, if you would agree, Denny.
Yeah, I think so. We know for a fact that if a list like this list here was used on a site in production as opposed to a site being built, it will unveil issues that really should have been addressed before. So going back to that first session, the whole value of this is to prevent these issues from even happening in the first place. So if the list is used to unveil some of the issues that have been introduced in the design and implemented on the site in production, then they're harder to fix because there's more components that are involved, and there's more complexity into fixing those things. So certainly more time, and I think that Aparna's estimation of 2 hours reflects that. And sometimes it's even more than that. I mean, just think about color contrast. Depending on how clean or sloppy CSS files may be, fixing Xcode values in different contexts may take a lot of time or may take a couple of minutes only. So that again would sort of impact the actual time required. But then the complexity of your process could also make it a much longer thing than it would be otherwise. If you have your own site that you're running on WordPress and all you need to do is go to your CSS file and make a change and update that file, it's a matter of seconds or minutes. If you have a multi-step staging environment process that you go through all these different oops before you can actually go to production, you can eventually go to production, it might be hours or days before you can actually get there. Most likely days, if not weeks. So the same issue becomes a much bigger problem on more complex sites than it can be on something that you just run on your own. But yeah, I mean, the partner started by saying it depends, and this is really one of those questions where it really depends on context.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully, again, these heuristics help prevent those issues in the first place. And if it's a little late because the site is already in production, then at least they can enlighten as to what might need to be fixed or addressed in order to lean towards more accessibility or inclusion.
Great, thanks, Denis. So another question coming from a designer is, what do you do when there's a really challenging accessibility problem and you just don't know if there's a possible way to fix it, or you just don't know what to do? At what point, when do you draw the line, I guess, is their question.
To me, it's a question of how realistic it is to fix something, both from the perspective of the budget and the time required, while measuring this against the actual impact on the users. The bigger the impact, the more pressing it should be, regardless of how complicated that is. My entire strategy when it comes to accessibility can be summed up to this particular thing, which is you want to get rid of the roadblocks, you want to get rid of the really critical issues, because if the only issues that you have on your site are smaller ones that are easily avoidable or you can easily work around, it's not as big of a deal. And I've yet to see one organization get sued because they had a multitude of really small pebbles on their site. But we see sites or organizations being sued all the time because they have these major roadblocks that prevent users from moving forward. So the entire strategy really is that you get rid of the bigger ones first. And I mean, this is so obvious that it's almost embarrassing to say it, but I mean, if all the stuff that's left are the issues that you can't that you can work around, I mean, of course, the amount will eventually add up, and it will become very annoying, and that might piss off your users as well, of course. But at least if you're removing the bigger issues out of the way, there's nothing that in and of itself stands as a valid reason for a lawsuit, for instance. Now, the question was also mostly about how do you handle those situations. So in some cases, if you can feel that you don't have an answer for that particular issue, but it is not a roadblock, then I guess is you just send it back in your backlog until you find a solution for it. I mean, most solutions today are on Google one way or another. So usually we can find the information there, or there's a multitude again of discussion lists where people might be able to help you. There are people that are paid to do stuff like that, so they can help you figure those things out. But if you're stuck on your own and there's a limited budget and you have to work on this internally, Google, I guess, is a good answer to that. But also prioritizing. Some of the issues are complicated to fix, but it really doesn't affect that many people, and they're very much isolated, so they really shouldn't be a priority to you. And I guess as soon as you acknowledge the fact, or you accept the fact that there isn't a single site out there that's perfectly accessible, and there's always going to be this one little thing at least that remains or that gets introduced at some point. There are always issues for accessibility on every given site. The sites that do really well, they make sure that they take care of the bigger ones, and they make sure that they are continually fixing the issues that they find. They just don't let them rot there. And if you do that, I think you're fine. I think it's fine to ignore issues every now and then if you don't know how to tackle them and they're not critical or blockers to begin with.
And to add to that, Denis, I think standards as well give the exceptions. If technically something is not possible, then we always have an exception, like for the image of text. If you cannot get to the same kind of thing with the HTML and CSS, then you tend to give an exception, right? So there is always the standards always say that, whatever is doable is what usually the standards are asking. And as you rightly said, if the impact is not critical, like if I cannot reach out for a functionality, or if I don't know where I am, then that would be the issue. But otherwise, I think the moderate issues, or where the user impact is not so big that I cannot use the website, then I think we should be fine with it there. But still, you're not accessible, but you need to keep that as a priority and get that out of your way. But it is not impacting user at the great scale that, I will not be able to interact with the functionality or with the web page or with the content.
Yeah, one little caveat to what you said. You said you are still not accessible. I would argue that you are accessible. If you only have that one little thing, you would not be compliant, but you would be very accessible still.
Correct. Agreed. Compliant is what it is.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, guys. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, but if we didn't get to your question, I'll be sure to pass those along to Aparna and Denis so they can answer those via email. I just want to thank Denis and Aparna again for doing a fantastic job, not only today on today's webinar, but for the rest of the series that we did. The first two parts of the series are available on demand, and if you weren't able to watch those, you can get those on our webinars page that Denis previously mentioned. But thanks again, guys. Let us know what you want to see in 2019. Keep an eye out for the resources and the recording and slides we'll be sending out probably sometime early next week. And thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.